guys, and thank you so much for joining into the seminar. We're going to spend some time today to talk about spotted lanternfly. Spotted lanternfly is something that you've probably noticed, so I hope at the end here to have a good idea for you of what does the life cycle look like, and give you some real straightforward points on what you can do with this. But to get started, as always, I always have fun with you guys that we're still in good old Groundhog Day. Luckily, Phil saw a shadow, whether that's good or bad. But we're all struggling through trying to figure out the new normal, seeing things over and over again. And I find funny videos all the time and pieces as far as how people are dealing with stress. And we're all trying to deal with things. And, as Karen talked about, understanding the basics of keeping ourselves happy and healthy for a safety moment. So, make sure you're doing what you can to socially distance and wear a mask and wash your hands and get your shot when it's your turn and do all those fun things so that we can all get out of this faster. So after the safety moment here, what's spotted lanternfly? So I hope, like I said, to give you an idea of what it is, what its life cycle is, what makes it tick, what are some of the best management practices that we know for this pest so far. And we've been doing a lot of work with this pest. USDA, IFAS, Penn State have been leading the charge on this, and most of that information is coming out of the last 3 or 4 years of field work that I've got summarized here for you so we can take a peek. So you may or may not have seen this. I can tell you that 2 years ago, I found this on my property. It was on a silver maple. It was in August, and I called up my friends at USDA in Maryland and said, hey, it's in New Jersey. Your charts need to be updated. And they basically said, yeah, we know. So it is widespread, and I'll show you some information a little bit later as far as what this spread looks like. As you guys are aware, this is an invasive pest. It did come in from Southeast Asia, China. It moved into Korea. What we know about this critter so far is that it's got a voracious appetite. It will feed on just about anything that makes plant sugar. So when we look at what happened in South Korea when it was introduced there, we found about 25 species that it likes there. When we look in southern China, there's about 65 plant species that it will feed on quite easily. And of course, we all know about this as first being identified in eastern Pennsylvania in 2014. And since then, it's expanded out rapidly. The initial quarantine charts look like this. So you guys are aware, starting in one spot, it was probably transported in here. It probably came in on a shipping container or on some other type of shipment of materials. And since then, we've been able to watch this guy move. And when we look at where the expansion of this pest is from 2014 to 2020, we can see that the area has grown a lot. And you can see on there some vague little purple dots. And I want to expand this picture and show you that those vague little purple dots have been individual findings of this pest, but we haven't been able yet to say whether or not the pest is established. But it's quite interesting when you look at these little purple dots. And I put in these overlays of lines. And the overlays of lines here, if you haven't figured out, so this is Route 81. So this is Route 95. This is Route 13. This is Route 95 South. This is the Pennsylvania Turnpike. This is the Northeast Extension. This is Route 90 going across New York. So we've got a lot of evidence that we as human beings are transporting this fella. We're moving this around on building materials, on wood, on you name it. We're moving this guy around. And when we look closely at this fella, we know that it's well adapted to moving. If you look closely at its feet, you see these little claws on its feet. They have these little suction cups on their feet, and they have a very high propensity to being able to attach themselves to things. So why are we seeing such huge inputs on identifying, educating, that these things can move, because they can attach to just about anything. So you can see here some pictures of, attaching to some camping chairs. They're on the spare tires of trailers. They're on the back of the researcher's legs. So these are very agile hitchhikers. They can move around a lot, and we can find them, as I showed you in the previous picture, following major highways, following major rail lines and arteries. And that's why, or how, we think these guys are being moved around, which is when you see things like Penn State asking you to inspect your vehicles when you're in a quarantine area. This is why, because this guy is being spread quite easily. You look across the country, and we're finding, again, to that graphic of I showed you, of following major roads. It's also moving with other sources. There was material found in Oregon. It was in a nursery shipment that was shipped in a container truck out to Oregon. Luckily, it was shipped in fall, and all of the adults that were found had died during shipping, and they couldn't find any egg masses on the container plants, but that doesn't mean that we won't eventually try to do that. So we are moving this guy around, and when we talk about, how we're moving him around, we have to understand the key life cycle. So we'll talk about the life cycle next. And when we talk about life cycle, it's important to understand that the life cycle knowledge is what we're going to use to figure out how we break this life cycle to get control of this pest. So if we look at the life cycle, you can find this in just about any guide. If you Google spotted lanternfly, and we know that the life cycle is fairly well contained. We start off with an egg mass, and we go through several different iterations of bug getting larger, until we get to this fourth instar, when it changes over to the adult, and then the adult goes back into the egg laying, and you see the cycle repeat itself. Some different pictures along the way. You can find this in the sense that the egg masses tend to be these grayish, almost look like plumber's putty. They can be varied in size. Sometimes you'll see this coating on the outside, sometimes you will not. So that's all about when these were laid, early in the season, late in the season. There's some other environmental factors that change the coating. When they hatch, you get this small black, no red yet, and that will be present for the first, second, and third instars. As they change over to more mature, the fourth instars, they start to pick up the red color. Then those red fourth instars molt into the adults. And of course, as we get the mature adults, you have these very telltale wings closed, wings open, with these red spots that are available. So one life cycle per year for this pest. And Michael, I'm turning it over to you for the first quiz question.
Time to launch a quiz. So, how many life cycles does a spotted lanternfly have per year? 1, 2, 3 to 4. It's always good to have the question right after the slide.
It's like we talked about the other day. It's that Chicago, I forget the name of the game, but it's softball with a really large squishy ball. You play barehanded.
Absolutely. I think at this point people are just messing with me and answering it incorrectly. 77% got it right. No, I apologize. 73% got it right. Well, how many life cycles does a spotted lanternfly have per year? The answer is 1. Let's close the quiz and take it away, Rick.
Very good. So I want to take a more in-depth look at some of the life cycle characteristics, because this is going to affect how we control this pest. So you've seen a lot of information about Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, starting to offer these cards, and these cards are designed to scrape eggs. So of course, the first thing I'm going to tell you is Destroying eggs, removing eggs is one surefire way to break the life cycle of this pest. So if you can find egg masses that you can scrape, whether they be low on the tree, whether they be on your truck, whether they be on firewood, on camping equipment, then by all means do whatever you can to remove those eggs and destroy those eggs. So we get the question of, well, since it's an egg and since it's a pretty common practice to use a dormant oil or a suffocating spray or something like that on egg masses, can I use one of those types of treatments on spotted lanternfly? Well, there's two things that come into place. And one of the key things that I want to point out here is that from work that we've been recently doing, or I should say that Brian Walsh and his group have been doing at Penn State, has been looking at where eggs are deposited on trees. And of course, it's very interesting that there are a lot of eggs deposited down low, but the key thing that I want to point out from the scraping perspective is that there are many eggs that are deposited well above 9 feet, which from a physical practicality makes it very hard for you to put up a ladder, climb up a tree, and start scraping eggs. Same thing with a homeowner. So if you can scrape the eggs, please do. If you can't scrape the eggs, now you're down to, well, can I use something like a dormant oil? Can I suffocate them? And the answer to that right now is inconclusive. We've got several studies that were done. Some of them were done in Korea. Some of them have been done here in the US. And quite frankly, the data is inconclusive as to whether or not you're going to get adequate control. And you can see here this JMS stylet oil, which is a type of horticultural oil. It's a vegetable oil base. And you can see here, if you look at the water control, you can see statistically different, not statistically different, not statistically different, statistically different, not statistically different. So we're all over the board on whether or not we actually have science that shows that the statistics will be effective every time, every place, killing the eggs. So does that mean you don't use a dormant oil spray for other pests? No, that means do that practice. Does it mean that you can count on a dormant oil spray to control spotted lanternfly eggs? And right now, the evidence says don't count on it, but don't avoid the practice for the other pests. So then we look at when these eggs emerge, and it's quite important to understand that these eggs are going to hatch. They do require a certain temperature and regime for them to hatch. There has been some growing degree day calculations generated for this. Those growing degree calculations are available. If you go to the Penn State Pest Watch website, you can punch in your zip code and get the growing degree days from that site for your area. And you can predict pretty closely when these eggs are going to hatch and when the first instar nymphs are going to crawl out and start to walk up and down the tree. And this is important because when you look at these guys coming out, we know that the egg masses, you can have 20 or 30 to 50 eggs in a mass, that these guys are all going to hatch pretty close together. Once they hit the growing degree days, there's about a 2-week window when these guys are going to pop out. And one of the nice things about understanding these first instars is that they are quite vulnerable. So dormant oil sprays, pesticide sprays, they're quite vulnerable at this stage. So when you think about another place that you can do a break in the life cycle, right here at egg emergence at this first instar stage, they're quite vulnerable and can be managed. When you look at what they do when they start feeding, again, we talked about they feed on a variety of materials. These insects are piercing and sucking insects, and you've noticed that they've timed their emergence to the beginnings of new growth in the spring. So all the long new succulent growth that's coming on, they will go after that because they like that soft tissue. And being piercing, sucking insects, they tend to go into the sugary areas. They'll populate up and down anywhere on the plant. When they're very young, they don't necessarily go to the bottom of the plant and use the stomates as the easy hole. They will actually take their feeding straws, if you would, their stylets, and poke them into the leaves and start to suck materials out of there. So again, piercing, sucking insects. And when we think about this piercing, sucking action, we talked about them being vulnerable to a contact spray when they just hatched. But now you're looking at the next vulnerability. Since they are piercing and sucking insects, they can also be vulnerable to systemic materials. So it's important to understand that systemic materials, well timed, at these early stages, these first and second instar stages, when they're rapidly feeding and they're feeding out here on the leaves versus the stems, is important for the timing of the systemics. As these guys start to get older, when you get to second, third, fourth instars, they start to pick up in mobility. And it is quite common for them to do a march. It is quite common for them to be knocked out of trees when they're feeding on the canopy edges onto the ground. And then they can walk on the grass from one tree to another. So they're quite active bugs. And some work has been done to actually look at, can they walk around? Can they move? And how far do they move? And some of this work is quite astonishing. When you look at Kelly Hoover's work, they actually put fluorescent materials on the backs of these guys, which is kind of fun, and then held a black light up and watched them, how far they moved. And you can see here that some of these guys are moving 20, 30, 40 meters. They're moving half a football field, a quarter of a football field, from one tree to the next in source of food. And typically they're on the canopy edge, they get knocked out of the tree, they walk to the next tree, and they can walk almost a half of a football field. And understanding that gives us a next place that we can do some population management. And that is, they will walk to the next tree and they will start to crawl up the next tree. So one of the IPM approaches is these sticky bands. Now, we can go on both sides of the equations for the sticky bands as far as whether we like them or not, because of course they are indiscriminate in picking up a bug walking across the sticky area. So you will pick up beneficial insects, you will pick up non-target insects, but you also have the opportunity at picking up some of these spotted lanternfly that have fallen off, have walked to the next tree, and have started to go up that tree. So you have the ability to reduce the population again. And of course, as we get to this fourth instar, the late thirds, fourth instars, they're really starting to change in what they do. And it's important to understand the location of their feeding. So we talked about the egg masses being on the tree, being anywhere from ground level up to as high as 15, 20 feet in the tree. We talked about the eggs hatching in the first and second instars, crawling, liking to go to the outer edge of the canopy to feed on the leaves, which are producing sugar. Well, as they mature, they start to move down inside the canopy to the first year growth and the second year growth. So they start to get on the twigs and the stems of the tree. So they're starting to change their location of feeding. They're not changing what they feed on. They're still piercing and sucking insects, but they're changing location. And of course, we get concerned about, their feeding. I will tell you one thing so far in the 5 or 6 years worth of research that's been done, we don't have any association yet of cause and effect of feeding and landscape plant death. We have indications of plant stress. We have indications of abnormal growth from excessive feeding damage, but we haven't killed a tree yet. So we're still looking at that to see if this will eventually succumb, with heavy repeated feeding. Does it knock down a tree? There's some evidence to suggest that the spotted lanternfly is an insect of opportunity. If it feeds on an area and weakens the trees and the trees aren't producing as much sugar, they'll move to the next tree, which is producing more sugar. So there's a little bit of evidence there too that they might be searching out or migrating in the population to constantly good feeding areas. So we look at this byproduct of their feeding in honeydew, and of course everybody complains about honeydew more because if it's unsightly, you know, getting on surfaces, because it's attracting insects that we don't like, in particular ground bees and wasps, which are all attracted to that sugary exudate. So whether it's, you know, sooty mold growth or nuisance bugs, honeydew is the byproduct of their feeding. So we think about this nuisance to control. And then, of course, we get to the fourth instar stage where they change and they molt into the adults. So in Pennsylvania, this is typically around the end of July. They've moved in from the outer edge of the canopy into the first and second instar year growth. They're now changing into adults. And those adults, if you really get to down to the gnat's whisker here, you can identify whether you have a male or a female by the red that's on the back of the insect's abdomen. As far as taking these two apart, from the top they look the same, but if you flip them over, it's kind of like a white grub. You can use this to identify what species. In spotted lanternfly, you can use this to identify whether you have a male or a female. So the one thing you notice here when they change to adults is the wings, And of course, these guys will fly. You can't see this really good. This was a video taken by Brian, but you can see all these little black specks here. And these guys are flying around from tree to tree. They're not superly great flyers, but they will fly from one species to the next. And it's important to understand this as we get to the next stage of talking about management, in that we know that they will walk to another tree and we know that they'll fly to another tree. So we'll start to talk about, do they have preferences for trees? And of course, we all know about the story about Aleianthus, tree of heaven, but I'll lead that into the next area. But first, time for quiz 2.
Let's launch quiz number 2, everybody. You should be seeing this question. For a Spanish lanternfly, when is the best timing for a systemic control treatment? Mid-March to April, mid-May to mid-August, early September to late October. I don't know, did we cover that?
We're going to see, because we're going to talk about that in depth coming up here. I'm hoping that from the discussion of the first, second, and third instars and their feeding locations
and their life cycles,
that people will figure out that there's a certain time when systemics will work.
Well, we're at 85% voted. Come on, folks, let's finish this off, and then we can move forward.
Not to let too much out of the bag, but it's very important to understand that these bugs are feeding in different locations through their life cycle. They're located in different locations through their life cycle, which means that treatment may be in one spot versus another spot as these insects change.
Gotcha. All right, so we're going to close up the quiz, and 42% said mid-March to April, 52% said mid-May to mid-August, and 6% said early September to late October.
Very good. Well, I like that the majority picked the right window of May.
You're up.
So one of the things that we notice about these guys is that as they start to mature, as we get to fourth instars, as we get to adults, that they will start to congregate on what we'll call hot trees. And it's very important to understand, you know, that these hot trees typically are relating to the time of year, the amount of sugar, their preference, how many of them are in our landscape. There's a whole host of factors that go into this. But the point that I'm making with this is that they will still prefer sugar-laden trees, and they will start to move onto trees that are more favorable as we go through the year, which does give us this ability to say, we talk about hot trees, some of the early management practices were focused on setting up what was called a trap tree. So we knew Ailanthus was a tree that they like to favor. So we were going to cut down the Ailanthus to remove that part of the life cycle. We'll talk about that in a second as far as, is that Ailanthus tree necessary for them to complete the life cycle? Or B, if they like certain trees or favor certain trees, A, what are those trees that they favor? And B, can we use those trees as traps? Like we would use a pheromone trap for a Japanese beetle, for example. Can we go to some of these trees that we've identified that they prefer at certain times of the year? And can we treat those trees so that we can, again, hit the life cycle and reduce the populations in the environment? And we've got plenty of information that shows that using systemic products, you know, early in the year, and as these insects start to migrate towards us, that we can get great activity with systemic materials depending upon the timing and the treatment, and that these trap tree types of systems will work. But I do want to stop you with this and remind you that these are highly mobile insects. They'll walk and they'll fly. And both of those things mean that regardless of all the treatments you did on your customer's property, if the surrounding environment is not treated and there are spotted lanternflies there, you cannot stop the progression, either walking or flying, from an untreated area to a treated area. All you can do is say, I've treated preventatively, or I'm going to respond curatively, and as those pests come onto a property, knock them down. And we know that we can get great results in that type of treatment regime. And then, of course, finally, the eggs are laid. And after the eggs are laid, typically, and I bet some of you have actually seen this, you'll actually find the adults dead. Typically, they'll freeze to death, still glued to the side of a tree. So they'll kind of mummify, but they'll go through this egg laying process. And again, you're looking at, when can I go through the management of control? We talked about, you know, can I suffocate the eggs? Not certain. Will the eggs freeze? Typically in this environment, no. Can I get a contact treatment when they first emerge? Yes. Can I use a systemic material when they're feeding out on the edge of the canopy? Yes. When they come back into the tree by walking, can I use a sticky band to reduce their movement back up the next tree? Yes. So there's a whole host of things here that we can do to reduce this population. And of course, when we look at the egg masses, we see, you know, you can see some older egg masses here. You can see some fresh new egg masses here. You'll typically see these on the trunks as high as 20 feet, but down at the ground level. A lot of times they can be located on the underside of branches. So they'll locate them just about anywhere, as long as they feel that they'll be protected and glued. When we look at an overview of the life cycle, and guys, you can pull this up from many of the Penn State literature pieces, but you see this type of pattern as far as, if you're going to scrape eggs, there's a certain windows after the eggs have been deposited that we want to get them scraped and reduce. If we're going to use that as a mechanism to reduce them in the environment, that's one thing we can do. And of course, those do have limits. If we're going to use a dormant oil or something like that, again, you notice that it's no big change in the typical timings of an arborist using dormant oils. We're still going to do those in February, March, and April. There's plenty of overwintering insects and mites that we can get great control with dormant oil. the key there is that just don't always count on it to reduce spot and lanternfly. Then, of course, we know the mobility of the insects and where they're feeding, and we can start to see that there's huge windows in here as far as when we can make systemic sprays, when we can do basal bark sprays, when we can do contact sprays. So you get this window, and of course, if you look at this carefully, you'll see most of this is timed to when the first, second, third instars are present, or when the fourth in adults are present. So through the entire life cycle of this bug, there are several windows. So I want to take a minute and really talk about just the physicality of where these bugs are feeding when you talk about treatments, and where, if you're going to do this, you know, it's not willy-nilly. You're not just walking out to a property and squirting everything. There's some ways that we can use best management practices in an IPM type of an approach and get some targeted treatments to really reduce. But it's understanding, again, where is the bug in the life cycle. So I start you off with this and just remind you that, you know, egg hatch is going to be in late April, early May. We've got some growing degree models predicted for that. And many of those eggs are in this area. You know, they're from the ground up inside the tree. So when you talk about, okay, I'm going to let these eggs hatch and I'm going to time this for my first and second instars, and I'm going to try to do a spray. Do I need to spray out here, or should I just get in here on the trunk where these guys are going to be crawling around in the egg masses? So we can target some sprays and reduce how much we put into the environment, because when we're talking about this May window, what else is out there? Of course, we have beneficial insects and pollinators that we have to be concerned about. So maybe there's a methodology that we can target where these pollinators aren't going to be, and make some appropriate treatments on those early instars to break the population. So after these hatch and we look at the first and second instars, they will migrate. They'll migrate up to the leaves, and you tend to find these first and second instars eating on the outside edges of the canopy. Well, what's the important part of that? Well, remember, if we've done a drench or if we've done a basal bark, systemic material, depending on the speed of the systemic material and its solubility, it is more likely going to go up in the xylem out to the edges of the canopy with evapotranspiration demand for water. So we're going to locate, if we do those systemic materials, we're going to locate those systemic materials on this outer edge where the bug likes to feed first. So there's some ideas about why we want to do this systemic, you know, early in the year. As the bugs get older, they start to migrate in from the outer edge of the canopy into the first and second year growth. So you notice that they're not out here on the edge anymore. Now they're back in here. So there's some issues that can pop up with the location of the systemic materials, and that is the systemic materials that we've drenched are solubilizing into the water. They're going up the trunk with evapotranspiration, or if we did a basal bark, they're doing the same, but they're migrating and locating out here on the outer edge, but the bug has started to move inside. So you might see some changes in the amount of control, not because the chemical's not there, but maybe because the chemical is in the wrong place for the bug. And finally, as we get to the fourth instars and the adults, they're starting to move back into the tree, back to that initial position where they're laying eggs. So now you get this opportunity that between the bandings that we're talking about when they're walking, or maybe some certain treatments here in the interior of the canopy where the majority of these bugs are, can start to lead us into some more managed control. So you look at IPM, we talk about locating trees of heaven, destroying the trees of heaven. There's been all sorts of information about them, using them as a trap tree, but it really begs the question, is the Allianthus necessary for survival? And a short answer is no. We've found that there's a change in the amount of eggs that are laid when Allianthus isn't around, but it doesn't necessarily break the life cycle or slow the bug down to a large degree. So using Allianthus as a trap to chemically kill them versus cutting all of them down is still a debate, but right now we know that Allianthus is probably not necessary for spotted lanternfly to survive. And the reason for that is, as I talked earlier, some recent work in the last 2 years has really identified some of the other insects, some of the other plant material, pardon me, that these insects like to migrate to. So you see rose and grape and tree of heaven and walnut and birch and willow and sumac and finally silver maple. So with that said, depending on what stage you've got, contacts, selective contacts, use of systemics, you can start to think about, well, what trees are on my property? The site that I'm trying to manage are some of these typical trees on there, and should I be looking at those trees more diligently than some of the others? And the answer to some of that is yes, because you can use these as some of your trap trees or your hot trees throughout the year, because we do know that the use of systemic materials on hot trees is quite effective. So we start to look at the control materials, and we've got a variety of materials that we've discussed. We've talked about dormant oils. When the bugs are young, they're quite susceptible to just about anything that you use on them. Some of the other materials that we like to think about are, pyrethroids and some other materials. And I bring this up just to show you that the pyrethroids are quite effective at managing this pest, and they're more effective than others. But one of the key points that I want to bring up to you is their duration of control. And there's a huge variation in the amount of control or the time of control that you get from different products. So work has recently been done looking at grapes, and these were all curative sprays done in a controlled setting, but it really does give us some insight into what's going on with the materials. And if you look at this across the modes of action, so this is the neonicotinoid thiamethoxam or flagship, and you can see you get a nice initial knockdown, but no real longevity on the outside of the plant. So what does that mean for practicality? Well, if I wanted to do a contact spray after the systemic, I can only count on this for a few days. And then after that, if more bugs walk in or fly in, I am not going to have adequate control later on. I look at the rhinoreceptor, the chlorantraniliprole and acelepryn, and you can see it's not very effective at all on this particular pest, on spotted lanternfly. I look at something like beta-cyfluthrin, which is Tempo, and again, you see this knockdown. You see a nice 7-day worth of control, but then the control drops off very drastically. You look at bifrenthrin or Talstar, you can see the control is a little bit different than the Tempo, a little bit longer. But again, after about 10 days, the control is dropping off. You switch over to fenpropythrin, which is tame, and you can see the level of control is maintained at 90% of above for 21 days, which gives us some very stark differences across these other two pyrethroid materials. We move over to things like carbaryl, and again, carbaryl, great knockdown, but no real longevity. And we look at things like Safari as far as dinotefuran, and again, as a contact material, it's not doing that well. And the reason for that is it doesn't have a great UV stability, which is why it's positioned as the drench inside the tree. So when you look at these control measures as far as reacting or you're in that that late August responsive material to a hot tree, there are some big differentials that show up between the products that we want to choose. And of course, we talked about the systemic materials, that the systemic materials really have a place early on in the life cycle so that they can get into the tree, they can move upwards with the xylem material, get out to the edge of the canopy where the first and second instars of this pest are going to feed initially. If you had to look at some potentials for treatment windows, you know, you've got this early window at egg hatch to knock them down at hatch. And of course, we have to be very careful on the products we choose as far as, are they going to be interactive with pollinators? And of course, that location of the spray. Do we need to spray the outer edge of the tree, or can we go in close to the trunk where these pests are first hatching and migrating? Then we get into the systemic window where we can do drenches or basal barks of material. Do remember that these products have different speeds, different solubilities, which is going to affect how fast they can get up into the canopy. And then finally, we talked about after these systemics have worn off, or after the systemics are stuck on the outside, but the bug is now on the inside of the tree, is there an opportunity to come back and do some spot treatment for invaders as necessary or requested by the customer? So you guys all know about Safari. Safari's been around for a while. It's one of the premier products being used for emerald ash borer, for plant hoppers, and we do have some specific labeling for the spotter and lanternfly. It doesn't injure the trees with basal bark or a drench. It's not restricted use. So there's a whole host of factors and features here that make it very easy to use. If you're not aware, we did submit and were granted 2EE recommendations, both in and out of New York State. So we do have some specific instructions about the use of that, and those labelings are covered for the use of Safari for this pest. And again, I just highlight the fact that the use of a systemic for this pest does have a place. It's got a place in a certain part of the life cycle, and you can integrate it into the rest of your program as far as what stage am I dealing with and what am I going to treat. But we do know that the use of systemics is a very straightforward practice at knocking these guys down. So if we have to do some takeaways as we're starting to wind up here, it's 11:45, and I'm sure there'll be questions. I want to drive home just several points for you. And one would be, don't change your program from the use of a dormant oil. So you're using dormant oils because you know they'll suffocate tent caterpillars and sawflies and mites. So keep that in your program, but just be aware that the data isn't supporting completely the fact that they may or may not be effective at controlling spotter and lanternflies, that they're egg masses. So more data is going to happen, but right now we're inconclusive on whether or not dormant oil is going to be effective. When you get that egg hatch using growing degree days, there's a short window that you can go ahead and knock down those young crawlers. So as we're getting close to growing degree days, we know the eggs are going to hatch. There's a very short window where a 2 to 3 week longevity material on the trunk where those eggs are going to hatch and crawl, they may interact with that and provide some good activity. The issue there is, though, is you have to be very careful about the placement of those materials because that is key pollinator and beneficial insect. So again, it's an opportunity to break the life cycle based on when these eggs emerge or hatch. Then you get into this use of systemics, and we know that when the nymphs hatch from the eggs, they're going to crawl out to the edge of the canopy. So the use of a systemic that's going to move up and move out to the edge of the canopy is really key here. This is where we get some of the early population knockdowns and some of the management of this pest. Remember that these insects are highly mobile. Whether they walk or crawl, they have the ability to walk 20, 30, 40 meters from one tree to the next if they've been knocked out by wind. at a young instar stage, they will move over to the next tree and start to crawl up, which gives us that ability to think about some of these banding types of mechanisms that we can use. We know that these insects are very broad feeders, but we also know that they have some selectivity at certain times of the year on certain plants. Fully don't understand why they migrate there. It may just be availability. It may be sugar source. There's a variety of reasons why, but we are seeing some of these trends where they like certain plants in the environment if they are available. That doesn't mean they're only going to be on those plants because they are very broad feeders, but it does give us some hints. If we're going to target some certain trees, it does give us some hints that we can target our treatments and take the best management practices to heart. Remember that these insects are moving in their feeding location. So they're starting out on the canopy edges when they're young, and they're starting to migrate into the first year growth, second year growth, into the main trunk of the tree over time. So that is going to change our application or our chemical treatment management methods as far as the location of the materials. And we can't really concentrate or rely on systemics, which are going to go to the outer edge of the canopy when the bug is going to be on the inside of the canopy. So we have to think about that. And lastly, I'm going to say this, is that these insects have the ability to walk and to fly, and that you're not going to prevent, if some of you are offering a guarantee as far as a guaranteed program, I hope that that guaranteed program incorporates multiple visits or numerous visits to inspect and treat as necessary based on populations, because this isn't a one and done. You can't just make one treatment and expect season-long management of this, because these guys are highly mobile and they're moving in from other untreated areas onto your property. And depending on what stage is moved in and the location of their feeding, maybe they're interacting with the chemical and maybe it's not. So if you think about a program approach, if you're selling a program approach, you want to make sure that you're doing a program approach that includes multiple site visits to inspect and treat based on populations that are there. All right, Mike, time for the final quiz question.
Yeah, I'm launching the final quiz question. Can your treatment efforts stop insect migration from untreated areas? The question is either a yes or a no response. Rick, I will tell you the reason that I asked you to do this presentation was, if you remember, about a month and a half ago, I called you up and said, Rick, I just need to know when is the one best time to make an application for controlling spotted lanternfly. And I was frustrated because you told me, but it doesn't work that way. It depends upon its life cycle, and you've got to use an IPM approach, and there's a lot of different things you can do. And I was frustrated because I'd been through a lot of these classes, and basically they were selling me a systemic insecticide like Safari, looked like it could be a one and done treatment. And then after talking to you and then you reinforcing with this presentation, I realized it's not a one and done. Yep. We have to look at this as an IPM approach and try to make treatments based upon all of its different life stages.
Yep. I mean, it's probably one of those things that if you were really super driven, it's probably a 3 application program. And when I say that, I mean that maybe that April and May program is a delayed horticultural oil, which is going to give you some knockdown of adults or of the first instar hatches, and is still going to give you some suffocation of sawfly and tent caterpillar and stuff like that. But even that might be a little late. But it's one of the softer things that you can do for beneficial insects. And again, timing that or placing that application in the middle of the tree instead of over the outside of the tree, and then following that up with the systemic that so many people talk about, because we know that products like Safari are going to have 2 to 4 month longevity in the canopy of the tree. But unfortunately, the chemical is going to locate to the outer edge of the tree because of its solubility and evapotranspiration. But the bug is going to move from where it likes to feed preferentially from the outside more into the middle of the tree. And understanding that opens up that third window, which may or may not be necessary depending upon the population, of a targeted spot treatment on the inside of the canopy to knock down these pests. So it's really, I mean, if you look at the main windows that you have to affect it, probably those 3 windows.
I find that Safari is, and from where I look at it, is an underutilized insecticide. Give these guys a list of the key insects that it is shown to have really good control.
Well, I mean, some of the ones that we talk about, hemlock woolly adelgid and emerald ash borer, if we're still fighting with those, a lot of great management there. But more importantly, things like lace bug, things like aphid, things like some of the hard and soft scales. I mean, it's got such a diversity, and because it likes to locate in the leaves, if you're looking at leaf chewers and leaf suckers, that is probably, some of its strong suit as far as the chemical locates where the bug is feeding.
Mm-hmm. The one thing we didn't touch upon that I'd like to touch upon real quickly, this is not something to get on a program that you need to go out and buy a sprayer. Safari can be a basal spray or trunk spray just using a backpack sprayer.
That's correct. That's correct. You can use a 3-gallon backpack, a 1-gallon hand can, a solid cone nozzle, to direct a basal bark treatment, or you can use, a stream type nozzle if you wanted to get 10 or 15 feet up the tree just to do the trunk. So, I mean, it's well versed as far as numerous application methods that you really, you don't have to have, I cut my teeth in the ChemLawn days where, we used to drive a truck with 5 tanks. We'd have 3 250-gallon tanks and 200-gallon tanks, and you'd have 5 different mixes. That's really not necessary for the use of Safari, because basal bark is a very easy methodology.
Thank you. So let's close the quiz, but the question: can your treatment efforts stop insect migration from untreated areas? And the correct answer is no, because it'll fly from one site to the next or crawl from one site to the next. So it'll just keep moving on. I'm going to close this down. And Doug, I'm hoping that you have questions for Mr. Fletcher.
I do. Okay, Rick. So the first question is from Steve. And Steve is asking, has research shown specific to temperature, cold winters, does that affect egg mass survivability going into the spring?
There's some limited research out of Korea that looked at some very cold temperatures over prolonged periods of time, and that having a slight effect on the fecundity or the survivability of those eggs. So if you looked at New Jersey or Eastern Pennsylvania, you probably aren't going to get those conditions. If you looked at upstate New York or New Hampshire or Vermont, maybe you might get those conditions. So we really can't rely upon cold temperatures or a period of cold temperatures knocking down those egg masses for us.
Okay, great. Next question is from Ray. Ray's in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, where we're headquartered. And Ray is seeing a lot of Ailanthus dying from what he would consider lanternfly damage. And he says he used cling wrap around the base of the trees with Vaseline brushed on, and it has definitely helped. Can I do anything else without using insecticides?
No, you're probably doing what you can. I mean, scraping eggs that you find on those Allianthus, if you want to keep them, you know, keeping those first and second instars, you know, from initially feeding on those trees. After that, when they fall off the tree and walk over to the next tree, so you've got that first, second, third, fourth instar stage when they're walking, which is pretty much May through about, let's say, late July, that the use of a sticky barrier on the base of the tree is going to be a physical barrier and knock down or glue them to reduce the population going back up the tree. If you guys pull out some of the Penn State material that looks at agricultural materials, and there's a few nursery examples, you know, just from the multiple feedings, they've actually taken areas where they've had spotted lanternfly penetrations into stems. They've peeled the bark back, and you can actually see the scarring underneath the bark. And of course, if you scar it enough, you'll close off the vascular system, and then you'll start to see stress, and then you'll start to see interruptions of water and sugar movement, and then you'll get branch dieback.
Okay, great. One last question, is there actually a Spanish lanternfly? Is that something that, or is that just a, I don't know, a myth?
Well, I'm not aware of a, quote, Spanish lanternfly. The lanternfly that we're dealing with has come out of Southeast Asia. I will point out the fact that there are multiple genetic variables of what we call lanternfly. For example, the one that lives in certain parts of China doesn't do as well as the one in Korea. And the one in Korea doesn't fly, but the one that's here in the United States flies quite effectively. So we do know that there's genetic variability out there. There hasn't been the work to pull these guys apart yet. But as far as a Spanish one, I'm not familiar with a Spanish one.
Okay,
I think
great.
somebody's being funny here, thinking about their teenage years.
Thank you, Rick.
You bet.
Those are all the questions I have in front of me.
Great, thanks, Doug.
Rick, I really appreciate it. You're probably one of my favorite speakers to listen to, and once again, you knocked it out of the park. It was a great job, a lot of good information, and my biggest takeaway is, different times of the year, you're going to have to dress differently because they're feeding at different parts, and that seemed to be the one piece of the puzzle. Other presentations that I've seen so far really didn't share that information as well as you did. So tip of the hat to you, sir. I really appreciate it.
It's just like any arborist landscape program. You're going to do certain things for certain pests at certain times of the year. It's not a one and done. So
and Safari is a phenomenal product. I love it. I use it. I had boxwood not boxwood boars, leaf miner.
Leaf miners or psyllids, probably leaf miners.
Yeah, and just we want to talk about, you could actually hear them feeding. Sprayed it. We're talking like maybe 2 hours later, there was no more feeding.
It is fun to hear that cessation of crunching, isn't it?
Well, this is weird. My wife calls me over. She goes, "The bushes are speaking," and I'm saying, "Honey, I'm a professional. We don't call them bushes." She goes, "Well, the bushes are talking."
Yes.
So I walked over. You actually hear them feeding.
No, you literally can hear it. It sounds like somebody is crinkling tissue paper when they're that active.
Yeah, absolutely.